The screams of coyotes echoed across the barren plains as Grace Matthews stood at the freshly dug grave, the last shovelful of dirt falling from her trembling hands. 3 months of nursing her husband through tuberculosis had ended yesterday at dawn, leaving her alone on their struggling homestead with nothing but a weather-beaten cabin, a solitary milk cow named Bessie, and a heart full of despair. Wyoming Territory, 1878. The land was as unforgiving as the elements that shaped it. Grace had come west with Thomas 2 years prior, full of hope and dreams of building a prosperous farm. Now at 24, she was a widow, watching as the cruel winds of the frontier erased her footprints, as surely as time would erase her husband's memory from this harsh land. "Just you and me now, Bessie," Grace whispered, patting the Holstein's neck as she led her back to the small barn adjacent to the cabin. The cow lowed softly, perhaps the only sound of comfort Grace had heard all day. Inside the cabin, the silence pressed against her like a physical weight. The shelves were nearly bare. A cup of flour, some dried beans, and a small sack of cornmeal were all that remained of their winter stores. Spring had barely arrived, and with it came the realization that without Thomas, there would be no planting, no harvest, and ultimately, no survival. She sank into the chair by the cold hearth, her husband's ledger open on the rough-hewn table. The numbers didn't lie. They'd spent nearly everything on medicine that had failed to save him. The seed they'd carefully saved for spring planting had been sold when Thomas first fell ill. Their tools, what few they'd managed to bring west, were worn and insufficient. Grace closed her eyes, listening to the wind as it worked its fingers through the chinks in the cabin walls. "I don't know what to do," she whispered to no one. Morning came with stubborn persistence. Grace milked Bessie and drank a cup of the warm, frothy liquid before storing the rest in the springhouse. She would make cheese today, she decided. It was something to do with her hands while her mind wrestled with the impossible task of survival. She was hanging the washing on a line stretched between the cabin and an old cottonwood when she saw the dust cloud rising from the eastern trail. Visitors were rare in this isolated stretch of territory. Grace's heart quickened in these parts. Strangers could mean many things, few of them good for a woman alone. She retreated to the cabin, reaching for Thomas's old rifle that hung above the door. It was loaded. She'd made sure of that the day after they'd lowered him into the ground. Grace watched through the window as a lone rider approached, his tall form silhouetted against the morning sky. The man rode a chestnut gelding, his hat pulled low against the sun. He wasn't dressed like the outlaws she'd heard tales about, no flashy vest or jangling spurs. His clothes were worn but clean, the practical garb of a working man. Behind him, a pack mule trudged dutifully, laden with canvas-wrapped parcels. He reined in his horse at a respectful distance from the cabin and removed his hat, revealing hair the color of wheat fields in late summer. "Hello, the house," he called, his voice carrying clearly across the yard. Grace hesitated, the rifle steady in her hands. "State your business," she called back, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "Name's Nathaniel Reed, madam. I work for the Rocking H about 20 miles east. Mr. Henderson sent me this way to check on the Matthews place. Heard there might be trouble." Grace stepped cautiously onto the porch, the rifle still in her hands though pointed at the ground now. "Thomas Matthews was my husband. He died 3 days ago." The man, Nathaniel, lowered his head briefly. "I'm mighty sorry to hear that, madam. Mr. Henderson will be sorry too. He thought highly of your husband." Grace remembered Thomas mentioning Henry Henderson, the owner of the largest cattle operation in the county. They'd met at a community gathering the previous summer, and Thomas had been impressed by the older man's knowledge of agriculture. "What did Mr. Henderson want?" she asked, still wary. Nathaniel shifted in his saddle. He heard your husband was ailing. Wanted to check if you needed anything. His eyes, clear and blue as the Wyoming sky, took in the cabin, the meager barn, the single cow grazing nearby. His gaze returned to her face, and though there was sympathy there, Grace was grateful to see no pity. Seems he was right to be concerned. We're managing, Grace replied stiffly. Though the lie was as obvious as the patches on her dress, Nathaniel dismounted, keeping his movements slow and unthreatening. Madam, I don't mean to intrude, but Mr. Henderson sent some provisions. Would you allow me to unload them? Grace considered the offer. Pride warred with necessity, but necessity won. She nodded once, sharply. Nathaniel approached the pack mule and began unfastening the bundles. There's seed corn and wheat here, he explained. Some potatoes for planting, beans, and a few other essentials. He glanced at the neglected fields beyond the cabin. And Mr. Henderson thought you might be needing help with the spring planting. I can't pay for help, Grace said bluntly. Mr. Henderson isn't asking for payment, Nathaniel replied. He owes your husband a favor, he says. Grace frowned. What favor? Don't rightly know all the details, madam. Just know that Mr. Henderson is a man who pays his debts. The sun climbed higher as Nathaniel unloaded the provisions, far more than Grace had expected. Besides the seed and food supplies, there were tools. A new shovel, hoe, and rake. Leatherwork gloves that would be too small for a man but might fit her. Packets of vegetable seeds, and even a small barrel of nails. Why would he do all this? Grace asked as Nathaniel carried the last of the supplies to her porch. Nathaniel set down a sack of flour and straightened, wiping his brow. Mr. Henderson has buried 2 wives himself. Says no one should face the frontier alone. Grace felt her carefully constructed composure begin to crumble. She turned away quickly, blinking back tears. Please thank him for me, she managed. I'll do that, Nathaniel said softly. He cleared his throat. If you're willing, I could stay a few days, help get those fields ready for planting. Won't be long before it's too late. Grace turned back to him, studying his face. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps no more than 30. His face was tanned and weathered from outdoor work, with laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of a man who found joy despite hardship. Why would you do that? She asked. It's what neighbors do, he replied simply. And Mr. Henderson gave me leave to help you get situated. Grace looked out at the untilled fields, knowing she couldn't possibly prepare them alone, not in time for planting. You can sleep in the barn, she said finally. And I can feed you, though the fare will be plain. Nathaniel smiled, and Grace was struck by how it transformed his face. Plain fare suits me fine, Mrs. Matthews. I'll get my bedroll and tend to the animals, then see about those fields. By mid-afternoon, Nathaniel had hitched Bessie to the small plow Thomas had traded for last year and was breaking ground in the nearest field. Grace watched from the cabin door as man and cow moved in steady rhythm across the land, dark earth turning over behind them like a promise. For the first time since Thomas had drawn his last breath, Grace felt something other than despair. It wasn't hope, not yet, but perhaps it was the space where hope might eventually grow. The days fell into a pattern. Nathaniel rose before dawn, tended to his horse and Bessie, then worked the fields until the light failed. Grace cooked, cleaned, and planted the kitchen garden close to the cabin with the vegetable seeds Nathaniel had brought. They spoke little during meals, but the silence was companionable rather than strained. On the 4th day, as Grace brought Nathaniel a dipper of water where he worked in the field, she finally asked the question that had been on her mind. Mr. Reed, what did my husband do for Mr. Henderson that warrants all this generosity? Nathaniel took a long drink before answering. Your husband saved Mr. Henderson's life last autumn, found him trapped under his horse in a ravine about 5 miles from here, got him free and brought him to your cabin until help could come from the ranch." Grace stared at him. "Thomas never told me." Nathaniel shrugged. "Some men don't like to boast about doing what any decent man would do, but Mr. Henderson doesn't forget such things." That night, as they sat at the table eating a simple stew, Grace studied Nathaniel covertly. His hands were strong but gentle, his movements efficient. He treated her with a respect that asked nothing in return. "Tell me about yourself, Mr. Reed," she said suddenly. "You know my story, but I know little of yours." Nathaniel looked surprised but not displeased. "Not much to tell. Grew up in Missouri. Father was a blacksmith. I learned the trade but found I preferred open skies to the forge. Came west after the war. I was too young to fight, but old enough to see what it did to my hometown. Worked cattle drives, then settled at the Rocking H 5 years ago. No family." Grace asked, then blushed at her boldness. "Had a brother, lost him at Shiloh. Parents passed a few years back." He gave a small smile. "Suppose the Rocking H hands are my family now. It must be nice," Grace said softly, "to belong somewhere." Nathaniel's eyes met hers across the table. "Everyone belongs somewhere, Mrs. Matthews. Sometimes it just takes a while to find your place." That night, Grace dreamed of Thomas. Not as he had been at the end, wasted and gasping, but as he was when they first came west, strong, laughing, full of plans. In the dream, he stood at the edge of their property, looking out at the fields. "You'll be all right, Gracie," he said, using the name he'd called her when they were alone. "I found a good place for us." She woke with tears on her cheeks but a strange lightness in her heart. Outside, she could hear Nathaniel already at work, the rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood punctuating the dawn chorus of meadowlarks. Spring advanced quickly. The fields were plowed and planted, the kitchen garden began to sprout, and Bessie provided milk daily that Grace turned into butter and cheese. Nathaniel had extended his stay twice, always with the explanation that there was more work to be done, and Grace had stopped questioning his reasons. They settled into a routine that felt almost like partnership. Grace found herself looking forward to their evening conversations, to hearing Nathaniel's stories of cattle drives and frontier towns. He listened with equal interest to her tales of growing up in Pennsylvania, of the books she'd read, and the dreams she'd had of becoming a teacher before meeting Thomas. "You still could, you know," Nathaniel said one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. "Teach, I mean. The territory needs educated women." Grace smiled wistfully. "Perhaps someday. For now, I need to make this farm work." "I owe it to Thomas to try," Nathaniel nodded, understanding in his eyes. "He chose well building here. The soil is good, with care it will provide." "I couldn't have done it without your help," Grace admitted. "I don't know how to thank you." "Seeing this place come back to life is thanks enough," Nathaniel replied, his voice warm in the gathering dusk. That night, Grace realized with a start that it had been days since she'd thought of herself as simply a widow. Nathaniel had brought more than seed and tools to her doorstep. He'd brought purpose, companionship, and the beginnings of a future she could imagine living. The following Sunday, Grace decided they should observe the day of rest properly. She rose early and baked bread, something she hadn't done since Thomas fell ill. The familiar motions of kneading and shaping the dough soothed her, and when Nathaniel came in from his morning chores, the cabin was filled with the homey scent of baking. "That smells like heaven itself," he declared, washing his hands at the basin by the door. Grace smiled, pleased by his enthusiasm. "I thought we might read some scripture today, being Sunday. Thomas and I always did." Nathaniel nodded. "I'd like that." After a breakfast of fresh bread and honey, another of Mr. Henderson's gifts, Grace brought out the family Bible. It was one of the few luxuries she and Thomas had brought west, its leather cover worn smooth by generations of hands. They took turns reading Psalms, their voices mingling in the quiet cabin. When they finished, Nathaniel closed the Bible gently. "My mother used to say that Scripture is like water in the desert. You don't know how much you've been thirsting for it until you drink." "Your mother sounds wise," Grace said. She was. Nathaniel's eyes were distant with memory. "She taught me to read using that book," said a man who knows the word will never be truly lost. The day passed peacefully. In the afternoon, they walked the property together, Nathaniel pointing out where a vegetable cellar might be dug before winter, where fruit trees could be planted next spring. He spoke of the future as if he assumed she would succeed, and Grace found his confidence contagious. "Mr. Henderson asked when I'd be returning to the ranch," Nathaniel said as they neared the cabin. "I've been away longer than planned." Grace felt her heart sink but kept her expression neutral. "Of course, you've done more than enough already. When will you go?" "I told him I'd like to stay until the corn is high enough to shade out the weeds, if that's agreeable to you." Relief flooded through her. "That's very agreeable, Mr. Reed." "Nathaniel," he said quietly. "After all this time, I think you might call me Nathaniel." "Nathaniel," she repeated, the name feeling right on her lips. "And you should call me Grace." His smile was as warm as the spring sunshine. "Grace it is, then." May turned to June, and the fields flourished under their care. Nathaniel built a chicken coop and brought 6 hens and a rooster from the Rocking H, explaining that Mr. Henderson insisted they were part of the original debt. Grace knew better, but accepted the gift with thanks. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the grass like earthbound stars, Grace found the courage to ask the question that had been on her mind. "Will you return to the Rocking H when harvest is done?" Nathaniel was silent for a long moment. "I've been thinking on that," he said finally. "Mr. Henderson has offered me a parcel of his land to start my own place, says I've earned it after 5 years of loyal service." "That's wonderful," Grace said, ignoring the hollow feeling in her chest. "You'd make a fine rancher." "The thing is," Nathaniel continued, his eyes on the darkening horizon, "I've grown fond of this valley, of farming." He paused, then added softly, "of the company." Grace's heart quickened. "Have you now?" "I have." Nathaniel turned to face her, his expression earnest in the fading light. "Grace, I know it's too soon to speak of such things. You're still grieving, and I respect that. But I want you to know that if you ever feel ready to consider a future that includes partnership, I would be honored if you'd consider me." Grace looked down at her hands, twisted in her apron. "Thomas and I had a good marriage," she said softly. "I never expected to think of another." "I understand," Nathaniel said, disappointment edging his voice. "But," Grace continued, finding courage she didn't know she possessed, "I find that my heart isn't as fixed as I thought." "You've brought something back to life here, Nathaniel, not just the land." Nathaniel reached across the space between them, his hand covering hers. "I won't rush you, Grace. We have time." And they did. As summer ripened toward harvest, so too did their friendship deepen into something more. Nathaniel moved from the barn to a lean-to he built against the cabin's west wall, still maintaining propriety while staying closer. They worked side by side, planning for the autumn and winter ahead, for the next spring's planting. In late July, they drove the wagon into town for supplies, the first time Grace had left the homestead since Thomas's death. She wore her best dress, faded but clean, and felt almost pretty with her hair freshly washed and braided. The small settlement of Riverton was hardly more than a wide spot in the trail. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and a handful of houses clustered around a dusty main street. But to Grace, who had seen only Nathaniel for months, it seemed bustling with activity. As they tied the horses at the hitching post outside the general store, the proprietor emerged, wiping his hands on his apron. "Well now, if it isn't Nate Reed. Thought you might have left the territory, it's been so long." Nathaniel shook the man's hand. "Just been busy, Frank. This is Mrs. Grace Matthews." Frank's eyebrows rose slightly as he took in Grace standing beside Nathaniel. "Mrs. Matthews, sorry to hear about your husband. He was a good man." "Thank you," Grace said, uncomfortable under the scrutiny of the storekeeper and the few townsfolk who had paused to observe the newcomers. Inside the store, Grace selected thread, needles, and fabric for winter clothing while Nathaniel arranged for grain and other supplies. She was examining a bolt of blue calico when she overheard two women whispering near the pickle barrel. "Didn't take her long to find comfort, did it?" one said, her voice low but perfectly audible in the small store. "Thomas Matthews barely cold in his grave," the other agreed. "And there she is, shopping with Nate Reed like they're old friends." Grace's cheeks burned, but she kept her head high, selecting the calico and moving to the counter. Nathaniel must have heard too, for when he joined her, his face was set in hard lines. "Don't pay them any mind," he murmured. "Small towns run on gossip." "They're right, though," Grace whispered back. "What must people think?" "They can think what they please," Nathaniel replied, loud enough for the gossiping women to hear. "Mr. Henderson sent me to help a neighbor in need, and that's what I've done. Anyone who says otherwise can take it up with him." The mention of the powerful rancher silenced the whispers, but the damage was done. The drive back to the homestead was quiet, both of them lost in thought. That evening, as they unloaded the supplies, Nathaniel finally spoke. "I've been thinking. Maybe I should go back to the rocking H for a spell. Give people less to talk about." Grace felt panic rise in her throat. "Because of idle gossip. I won't let them drive you away, Nathaniel." "It's not just that," he said, his voice gentle. "I think maybe we both need to be sure of what we want. Distance might provide clarity." Grace wanted to argue, to tell him that she was already certain, but pride held her tongue. "If that's what you think is best." Nathaniel left the next morning, promising to return in 2 weeks to help with the early harvest. Grace watched him ride away, Bessie mooing forlornly beside her as if the cow too felt the emptiness of his departure. The days without Nathaniel stretched endlessly. Grace threw herself into work tending the garden, preserving vegetables, caring for the chickens and Bessie. But the cabin was too quiet at night, the meals she prepared for one too solitary. She had grown used to his presence. She realized not just the help he provided, but the comfort of his company, the sound of his voice, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. She missed him with an ache that surprised her in its intensity. A week after Nathaniel's departure, a summer storm rolled across the plains. Grace watched anxiously as the sky darkened to an ominous green, the wind whipping the corn into a frenzy of motion. She secured the animals in the barn and retreated to the cabin just as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The storm raged through the night, wind howling around the cabin like a living thing. Grace huddled in her bed, praying for the roof to hold, for the crops to survive. Sometime after midnight, a tremendous crash shook the structure. Grace lit a lamp with trembling hands but could see nothing amiss inside the cabin. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving a washed, clean world behind. Grace stepped outside to survey the damage and gasped. The huge cottonwood that had stood near the spring house had been struck by lightning, its massive trunk split down the middle. One half had fallen directly onto the spring house, crushing it. Grace sank to her knees in the mud, overwhelmed. The spring house had been essential for preserving milk and butter through the summer heat. Without it, much of what Bessie produced would spoil before it could be used or sold. For the first time since Thomas's death, Grace gave in to despair. She covered her face with her hands and wept, great heaving sobs that tore from her throat. All the grief, fear, and loneliness she had suppressed came pouring out at once. She didn't hear the approaching hoofbeats over her sobs. It wasn't until a familiar voice called her name that she looked up, blinking through tears. Nathaniel dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, rushing to kneel beside her. "Grace, are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to speak through her tears. Nathaniel's arms went around her, strong and sure, and Grace leaned into his embrace, letting the solid warmth of him anchor her in the storm of her emotions. "I saw the storm moving this way," he explained, his voice rough with concern. "Couldn't stay away, knowing you were facing it alone." When her tears finally subsided, Grace pulled back enough to see his face. "The spring house," she managed. "Everything's ruined." Nathaniel looked over at the crushed structure, his expression turning thoughtful. "Not everything," he said. "The stone foundation looks intact. We can rebuild the rest." Grace asked, her heart lifting despite her despair. Nathaniel's eyes, so blue against his tanned face, met hers. "If you'll have me, yes. I've had my time of clarity, Grace. 2 days at the rocking H was all I needed to know where I belong." "And where is that?" she whispered. "Here," he said simply. "With you, if you'll have me." In answer, Grace raised herself up and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was brief but held all the promise of her heart. When she pulled away, Nathaniel's expression was one of wonder and joy. "I'll take that as a yes," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. They married 3 weeks later, with Mr. Henderson himself standing as witness. The ceremony was held in the field before their cabin, where corn now stood tall and green against the blue sky. The preacher rode in from Riverton, and even the gossips from town came, curiosity overcoming disapproval. "Do you, Nathaniel James Reed, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" the preacher asked, his voice carrying across the assembled neighbors and friends. "I do," Nathaniel replied, his eyes never leaving Grace's face. "And do you, Grace Elizabeth Matthews, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Grace looked up at Nathaniel, seeing in his face all the promise of the future they would build together. "I do," she said, her voice clear and certain. That night, as husband and wife, they stood on the porch of what was now their cabin, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Wyoming sky. "I never expected this," Grace said, leaning against Nathaniel's side. "When Thomas died, I thought my life was over too." Nathaniel's arm tightened around her waist. "Life has a way of surprising us. When Mr. Henderson sent me here, I thought I was just repaying a debt. I had no idea I was riding toward my future." Grace turned in his embrace, resting her palms against his chest. "You brought me more than seed and tools, Nathaniel. You brought me hope when I had none." "And you gave me a home," he replied, lowering his head to kiss her. "Something I've been searching for longer than I knew." Their kiss deepened, and as Nathaniel lifted her into his arms to carry her over the threshold into their shared future, Grace knew that what had started with loss had transformed into something beautiful, a love as vast and enduring as the frontier itself. The seasons turned, one into another, marking the passage of time across the Wyoming landscape. The homestead flourished under their joint care, expanding with each passing year. Nathaniel built a proper barn to replace the lean-to, added rooms to the cabin as their family grew, and planted the orchard he had once envisioned along the western boundary of their property. Grace found that marriage to Nathaniel was different from her first union, not better or worse, simply different. Where Thomas had been serious and methodical, Nathaniel approached life with an easygoing confidence that balanced her own tendency toward worry. They complemented each other in ways that made the hard work of frontier life feel more like a shared adventure than a burden. Their first child, a son they named Samuel, arrived a year after their wedding. Grace labored through a long summer night, with only the midwife from Riverton to assist. Nathaniel paced outside until dawn when the thin, indignant wail of new life finally pierced the cabin walls. When he was allowed inside, the sight of Grace cradling their son, tired but radiant, brought him to his knees beside the bed. "He has your eyes," Grace whispered as Nathaniel gently touched the downy head. "And your determination," Nathaniel replied, noting the strong grip of tiny fingers around his own. "He'll be a fine farmer one day." Samuel was joined 2 years later by a daughter, Elizabeth, named for Grace's mother. She arrived in the depth of winter, during a blizzard so fierce that Nathaniel had to deliver her himself, following Grace's breathless instructions while the wind howled around their snug cabin. "You're doing fine," Grace assured him, even as another contraction seized her. "Just be ready to catch her." Nathaniel had faced stampeding cattle with less terror than he felt in that moment, but when Elizabeth slipped into his waiting hands, red-faced and angry at the indignity of birth, his fear transformed into awe. "She's perfect," he said, placing the squalling infant on Grace's chest. Just like her mother, life settled into the rhythms of family and farm. They added cattle to their holdings, starting with 2 heifers gifted by Mr. Henderson as a christening present for Samuel. By the time Elizabeth was toddling around the yard, chasing chickens and getting underfoot, they had a respectable herd grazing the western pasture. The springhouse, rebuilt stronger than before, became a source of income as Grace's butter and cheese gained a reputation in Riverton. Her wheels of aged cheddar, wrapped in cheesecloth and dipped in wax, commanded premium prices at the general store. "Mrs. Reed's cheese is worth the extra penny," Frank told customers who questioned the cost. "Finest this side of the Mississippi, or I'm no judge." When Samuel was 5 and Elizabeth 3, Grace realized she was expecting again. This pregnancy was harder than the previous 2, leaving her exhausted and ill through the early months. Nathaniel took on more of the household duties, his large hands surprisingly deft at kneading bread and mending clothes. "You should have been a seamstress," Grace teased one evening as she watched him repair a tear in Samuel's trousers, "and deny the world my cow-punching skills." "That would be a tragedy," he replied with a wink. The baby, another boy they named Thomas in honor of Grace's first husband, arrived in the fall as they were bringing in the harvest. He was smaller than his siblings had been, but with a lusty cry that belied his size. "He'll be a fighter," the midwife predicted, and indeed he proved to be the most stubborn of their children, determined to keep up with his older brother and sister from the moment he could crawl. As the children grew, so did the prosperity of their farm. The orchard began to bear fruit, the cattle multiplied, and each harvest was more abundant than the last. They added a hired hand, then another, building a bunkhouse for the men who helped with the heavier work. Nathaniel's reputation as a fair employer spread, and they never lacked for help during the busy seasons. Grace, for her part, became known for her hospitality. Sunday dinners at the Reed farm became a tradition for single men working in the area, who came as much for the home-cooked meal as for the chance to sit at a family table and remember the homes they'd left behind. "You're feeding half the territory," Nathaniel observed one Sunday as Grace prepared enough food for their family and the 6 ranch hands who would join them after church. "Just doing my Christian duty," she replied, though they both knew it was more than that. Grace remembered all too well the isolation of frontier life and believed that breaking bread together was a simple but powerful remedy for loneliness. The children thrived in the freedom of their rural upbringing. Samuel, serious like the uncle he'd never met, showed an early aptitude for working with animals. Elizabeth inherited her father's charm and her mother's quick mind, learning to read before she was 5 and devouring every book they could procure. Young Thomas was the adventurer, always exploring, climbing, testing boundaries. "That boy will be the death of me," Grace declared after finding him on the barn roof for the 3rd time in a week. "He comes by it honestly," Nathaniel admitted, recalling his own youthful escapades. Better to teach him caution than try to tame his spirit. As the territory moved toward statehood, their community grew. A proper church was built in Riverton, then a schoolhouse. Grace, fulfilling the dream she'd once confided to Nathaniel, taught reading and writing to the local children 2 days a week. "You were right," she told Nathaniel after her first day of teaching. "This is what I was meant to do." "I'm just glad you have the chance to do it," he replied, genuine pleasure in his voice. "Those children are lucky to have you." The years weren't without hardship. A drought in '84 nearly ruined them, saved only by the deep well Nathaniel had insisted on digging the previous year. A harsh winter in '86 decimated their cattle herd, forcing them to start rebuilding from scratch. And there was the scarlet fever that swept through the county in '89, taking the lives of 2 children from Riverton and leaving Elizabeth weakened for months afterward. Through it all, their partnership remained strong. The love that had grown between them deepened with each challenge faced and overcome together. They argued sometimes fiercely but never went to bed angry, a rule they'd established in their first year of marriage. "Life's too uncertain out here to waste time on pride," Nathaniel had said after their first major disagreement. "I'd rather be wrong and reconciled than right and alone." On their 10th wedding anniversary, Nathaniel surprised Grace with a gift he'd been planning for months. A piano, transported at great expense from Denver by wagon train. It arrived scratched and woefully out of tune, but to Grace, who had learned to play as a girl in Pennsylvania, it was a treasure beyond price. "How did you manage this?" she asked, running her fingers reverently over the ivory keys. "Sold that prize bull and didn't tell you," he admitted with a sheepish grin. "Figured you might object to the extravagance." "I would have," she agreed, then pulled him down for a kiss. "And I would have been wrong. Thank you, my love." The piano transformed their home, filling it with music that had been missing from Grace's life since she'd left the East. She taught the children to play, and winter evenings were spent around the instrument, singing hymns and folk songs while the wind howled outside. The century's end brought prosperity to their region. Wyoming, now a state, was changing rapidly. The railroad had come through, bringing more settlers, more commerce, more connection to the wider world. The isolation that had once defined frontier life was gradually receding. On a warm evening in the summer of 1900, Grace and Nathaniel sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching their 3 children and the 2 young hired hands playing an impromptu game of baseball in the yard. At 46, Grace's hair was threaded with silver, and lines of laughter framed her eyes. Nathaniel, 52, moved more slowly than in his cowboy days but still worked alongside his sons from sunup to sundown. "Did you ever imagine this?" Grace asked, gesturing to the thriving farm around them, the fields of grain ripening in the summer sun, the orchard heavy with fruit, the substantial barn and outbuildings that had replaced the humble structures of her widowhood. Nathaniel took her hand, his calloused palm warm against hers. "Not specifically," he admitted, But I knew from the moment I saw you standing on that porch with Thomas's rifle that you were a woman worth building a life with." Grace laughed, the sound as clear and joyful as it had been in her youth. "I was terrified that day, thought you might be a bandit. Instead, I was just a cowboy with some seed and tools," he said, his eyes twinkling with the memory, "and perhaps a little hope to share." "The hope was what mattered most," Grace said softly. "Everything else we could have acquired somehow, but hope, that was the true gift." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the land in gold and shadow, they sat in companionable silence, hands clasped between them. In the yard, Samuel hit the ball with a resounding crack, sending it soaring toward the orchard as Elizabeth cheered and Thomas raced to retrieve it. "We've been blessed," Nathaniel said, watching their children. "Yes," Grace agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder. "More than I ever dreamed possible when I stood beside that fresh grave all those years ago." The darkness gathered, stars pricking the vast Wyoming sky one by one. In the distance, a coyote called, its voice rising in the age-old song of the plains. Bessie's descendants lowed softly in the pasture, and somewhere in the barn, a horse nickered in response. "I love you, Grace Reed," Nathaniel said, his voice deep with emotion. "Have from the first moment, I truly saw you not just the widow needing help, but the woman with more strength and heart than anyone I'd ever met." Grace turned her face to his, the lines of age falling away in the gathering dusk, until she was again the young widow and he the cowboy who had ridden into her life with hope on a pack mule. "And I love you, Nathaniel Reed. For the man you were then, the man you are now, and all the moments in between." Their lips met in a kiss as natural and necessary as breathing. Around them, the homestead settled into evening's peace, a testament to what could grow from the barren soil of loss when nurtured by love, labor, and unwavering hope. From a solitary milk cow and an empty cabin to this abundance, it was a journey neither could have foreseen, but one they would choose again without hesitation. For in finding each other, they had found not just survival but joy, not just a homestead but a home, and in that home, a love as enduring as the land itself.